Hello. Hi, you guys. Welcome. All right, so what we're getting into today is our failed first government and the establishment of our second and present government, our federal republic. All right. And so with today's themes, um, the first one is a very old thesis. To be honest, it kind of bores me because on so many topics of American history, you have disagreement. You have, you know, you have discourse, you have debate, etc. And this one just hasn't had its fair share of that. This thesis has withstood the test of time for quite some time. So to some people, it's more credible for that reason. But I tend to beg to differ. I think something is more credible when it's put through the fire of criticism and an alternative, looks at it, and then it still, merits credibility after that. So I can't tell you why. I really can't. But getting my books from the '90s in school and getting books today, they propagate this thesis. So it's very unoriginal. Um, I don't know necessarily how thought-provoking it is, but it is what it is. And so I went ahead and went with it. Okay. So, but before I do, are there any questions? Any questions or comments from anyone? All right. Okay. So getting into this one, right, is the whole idea is during the War for Independence, that was the height of the dissemination of literature that was influenced by the French and the Scottish Enlightenments. As you may recall, the previous assignment, Bernard Bailyn's thesis. Remember, he focuses upon ideology as opposed to like greed, ambition, different classes with their own interests, like Howard Zinn did at the end of that assignment. With this one, right, it's kind of like with Bernard Bailyn. Um, there was just a lot of pamphlets, a lot of speeches, a lot of newspaper articles, etc., that propagated beliefs like natural rights and the social contract, and it really celebrated uh, kind of egalitarian rhetoric. Now, right away, you should be a little suspicious of that, with the fact that we maintained slavery. We didn't touch that issue, right? We maintained the idea of no citizenship rights for Native Americans. We maintained the right of no the old assumption of no citizenship rights for women. All right, and so it didn't seem to be that influential, but the rhetoric at least was there. And so the idea was is we were kind of in an enlightened, a semi-enlightened mood, if you will, during the War for Independence and just after. We also, right, with our propaganda, we depicted the British as the anti-model, right? Instead of, and it's funny because we outgrew that, didn't we? I think of like Woodrow Wilson later on writing how the best things in American political tradition emanate from England. So we definitely outgrew that, but not at this time. We literally were fighting and killing each other um, amidst the war for independence. And so we definitely at this time in this chapter of our history depicted the English as the anti-model. And what was really highlighted in depicting them as such was the fact that England still had a landed aristocracy. And remember, aristoi in Greek means the best. So, that's having a group that contends that they're the cream of the crop. They're entitled as the best demographic of people to alone sit in certain seats of power and to make certain decisions, to do certain things for a living, etc. And so we definitely had an anti-aristocratic bent at this time. You'll see it again. It's revived with a vengeance when we do Andrew Jackson's time period, right? Where everyone always uses the word democracy when we get to Andrew Jackson. Well, it depends on your definition of democracy. But in this one, right, just the standard is that the demos in Greek means the common people. Okay. And so at this time, there was more uh, political participation, more economic opportunities for more of the common white kind of WASP American men than had been available previously. All right. And we were proud of that. So we get this shot out of creating a government, and we ensured that it was relative to England, more democratic, and that it was also more decentralized. Remember from the Scottish Enlightenment, the idea is that one of the ways of having a check on power is to keep it small and localized. The small part, you don't want too many resources available for the access of the leaders of the federal government on their hand that they could use for ill against the people. And then localized, it was the idea that, if you know where your politicians live and you live rather close to them in proximity, that you could better hold them accountable as to how they rule. So even the fact that created a confederacy that speaks to I think, to the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment. Because remember, the Scottish Enlightenment was libertarian. Government don't tread on me. Distrust of big government, etc. All right. And so with the Confederacy, states have a lot more autonomy than the states do today in our federal republic, right? When we get to our Constitution, you'll see, but not only are there pieces of the Constitution like Article 1, Section 8 that emphasize a lot of powers that the federal Congress has over the country, but then also there are clauses that are an absolute just overt check on the states saying they shall not do this, they shall not do that, and have the same powers that the federal government has. It wasn't the case with a confederacy, right? A state is almost autonomous. It's almost independent in being able to do its own thing. And then, of course, the idea is they band together deliberately, loosely, um, and they band together over the big stuff, right? And the big stuff, mainly at that time, is we were afraid as an infant nation that we were going to be invaded again by a European power. And so we had Spain to the west along the Mississippi River, and it was a constant fear because that Louisiana territory to the west at times was controlled by the French, and people like Napoleon possessing it. It was a scary thing, although Napoleon is yet to come. So at any rate, when we created this, the idea is that this generation messed it up. They had a chance, kind of like an adolescent, having a chance to have more autonomy, to have more participatory power in government, and that adolescent behaved like an adolescent, and forfeited his or her opportunity to live under such institutions, right? They had the freedom and they messed it up so that there became an almost consensus, of course, amongst the conservatives, but even the liberals, you can make the argument, even the liberals grew quiet. So, like, for instance, having a democratic government in the states, at least more democratic than before, and having a deliberately decentralized confederation or confederacy was right up the alley of ideologically of Thomas Jefferson. But it became such a mess. So many things happened that when it became known that the conservatives were conspiring to put an end to it, to this experiment, and to create something more centralized and less democratic, for better order, uh, Thomas Jefferson fled to France, and that's part of the popular interpretation of great man history of Jefferson. Is Jefferson was very non-confrontational. He hated confrontation. You wouldn't know that from what he wrote, but in person he was a different uh, creature. So at any rate, he didn't even stick around to put up a fight when they went to put an end to this Democratic Confederation. Okay, he fled to France, and so at any rate, what went wrong? What went awry? Well, for one, the main events, etc., patterns that are depicted are usually just two, and one is the short-sighted greed of the common people through their popularly elected legislator. Okay, is you would imagine before even some of these states did anything for a public school system, anything like that, which by the way, by this time, it wouldn't have worked for several reasons that we'll get into soon when we get to Jefferson. But at any rate, instead of thinking of civic institutions like that, right? In many states, the legislators were obsessed with the obtaining of credit for the common man. And so, because they're chasing after the American dream, that ever elusive American dream that'll be named later. At this time, right, it's called socioeconomic ascension, moving up the social and economic ladder. So, in the main ways of doing that, we're entrepreneurial, right? Start a business of some sort, especially becoming a cash crop farmer, right? A reliance upon one crop, selling it for profit, and then purchasing all your other needs. So, at any rate, this happens from state to state. And what you find are the vagaries of the weather, and for other reasons and things that were perhaps beyond their control, uh, harvests did not come through, crops went bad, etc. And so then what they would do is they would apply their political pressure on their elected legislative reps to grant them stay laws. And the stay laws would give them an additional 2 to 5 years to pay off their loans because their crop had gone bad. They'd borrowed money to start the crop, and they were assuming they'd make profits from that crop from which they could pay their debts. But not so when the crops didn't come through. So they tried stay laws in several states several times. And in a couple of dramatic cases, they even declared bankruptcy laws so that they never had to pay their debts back, those loans. So finally, in a place like Massachusetts, uh, popular opinion started to sway because they thought, you know what, this is, Montesquieu said that, right? That if any single faction that shares the same self-interest, if they have an inordinate power uh, greater than all the other factions, look out. That could be the next source of tyranny. And so people finally said, enough is enough to these cash crop farmers and these poor, ambitious white men. And they said, they established a law in Massachusetts saying you have until this date to pay your debts, or else that we're taking you through the customs and claims and the debt courts. So that's exactly what happened. And when they began to set up the debt courts, the Massachusetts men, it didn't happen right away, but they slowly started to almost like unionize and join with one another. And they eventually dramatically came into some of the courts with their guns. And they actually even put on those who had them old War for Independence Continental Army uniforms, as if they were fighting against the moneyed class, in the name of freedom all over again, but this time domestically. And so they threatened to kill the judges, and the judges, came back to the coast, told the elected legislator what had happened, and the elected legislator raised the militia, and the militia came to actually fight these rebels, known as Shays' Rebellion. Okay, and the rebels are going to lose. But when this happened, George Washington's like, good God, this is too far. The common people had their chance and they blew it. And now they're not even respected the old traditions that come back to Rome of, paying your debts. Because of course, you would have to put your farm up as collateral. And so if you couldn't pay your debts, they would foreclose on your farm. And they weren't about to let that happen. So this was a very well documented instance of the common people abusing their freedom and just thinking about their wallets and their own greed, and it causing quite a stir. And what's interesting is the founding fathers had a classical education, right? So they had read Aristotle, they had read Plato, and their summations of democracy, of rule by the demos, the commoners. And they said such things would happen, that basically the common people, especially the desperately poor, are going to invariably be led by their appetite, right? And I think of like Freud later on calling it the id, right? So a little child wants what he or she wants, and they'll walk through. I walked through a restaurant one time, and my son liked what was on. My toddler son liked what was on someone's plate, and he grabbed it off the man's plate. It was so embarrassing. But that's just like a walking id, right? Just this is mine, I want it, mine, that kind of stuff. And so they don't have the superimposed superego, right? The voice of conscience from mom and dad, from teachers, from authoritative rulers that tells them, I wouldn't do that. That's unethical. I wouldn't do that. That's going to lead to adverse circumstances, etc. And that even if they are slightly familiar with and have such a superego, they don't let it prevail, and they let their id prevail over it. So to the Greeks, right, education was tantamount to the acquisition of virtue. You learned what was just and right in philosophy, and you accustomed yourself to the virtuous life through self-discipline and what Aristotle called habituation. And habituation is making a habit of making virtuous decisions. But to the Greeks, right, all that discipline comes with education. So when you look at the common uneducated people, they said, of course, they don't possess such, and they're just going to be led by their appetite. And so, and then they said what would happen is it would eventually cause chaos, a democracy. And I don't mean a representative democracy where you elect your reps, like in our republic today, but I mean like a unadulterated direct democracy, where like in Athens, Greece, under Pericles, where they practiced pure democracy. So they said it's going to end in chaos, and then from the chaos, the credible, easy to believe what they hear, ignorant, greedy people are going to fall victim to a demagogue. And that demagogue, right, is someone who claims to be one of them, knows their emotional buttons and the intellectual buttons to push, to manipulate them, so that they could become their leader. But that demagogue always has his or her own agenda. And so they said that's what would happen with a democracy. So the founding fathers read that stuff, right, from Aristotle and Plato. And the conservatives began to almost laugh and shake their heads until the Patrick Henrys, the Thomas Jeffersons, and the other liberals, see, I told you so. You should have known better. You've read your Aristotle, you've read your Plato. You knew that a democratic government would become chaotic, like with Shays' Rebellion. And you had no excuse but to see this coming. And so then, in addition to that, was the fact that we had a loose confederation, right? Deliberately loose confederation. And it was virtually impossible to get anything passed because you had to have a super majority. You had to have 2/3 of the states. If you went for taxes, if your reps in your area representing you said no to the tax, then it was not collected in that area, only in the areas where the reps had said yes. So they didn't even have the coercive power of taxation to raise money. Okay. And then you had the commercial wars between New Jersey and New York, whereby they would kind of put tariffs on goods that came from one state to the neighbor. They would make the merchants from the nearby state have to pay all kinds of fees and like punish them for coming into their state and trying to do business. And so it became this silly game of retaliation between the two states. And then, of course, you had about three states, Pennsylvania, Virginia. I can't remember the third one, but they fought over the Ohio Valley, all contending that the Ohio Valley, the future states of like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio around the Great Lakes to the west, they contended that it was theirs by the original charter in the language of their original charters. And so they almost went to war with one another over this Ohio Valley. And people, even, the liberal Thomas Jefferson was furious because he said, no, we're setting this area of the Ohio Valley apart to create future states out of it. And also, he was proud of the fact that he was going to do away with slavery and require public schools in those future states. And so when you looked at confederations like the Peloponnesian League of the Greeks, the Italian city-states during the Renaissance, you find that they oftentimes could not get anything done in coordinated fashion, and they also were at each other's throats, jealous of one another, fighting with one another, etc. And that's exactly what was happening during this confederation. So again, if you had read your history as a politician, as an educated politician, you should have known, the conservatives said, what would become of a loosely devised confederacy. All right. So finally, especially after Shays' Rebellion, the conservatives met. They're supposed to meet in Maryland, and they contended that they couldn't get a quorum. They couldn't get enough members there to pass anything. So they put it in their own hands in Maryland to have one in Philadelphia. And when they did not consult with the elected leaders of the Confederation. They did it on their own. And of course, that caused a bit of an uproar. And they knew, everyone knew, liberal and conservative alike, that when they did meet in Philadelphia, they were going to change, they were going to scrap this whole system, and they were going to devise something else. And like I said, with Thomas Jefferson, even the loud Patrick Henry, and the other liberals, they grew quite quiet relative to the past. They grew quite quiet. And according to this interpretation, is because they knew deep down that the conservatives were right, that too democratic of a government brings many chaotic and just kind of baneful consequences. And having too loosely constructed of a confederation is too much of a mess as well. All right. And that's why you see when they give the reason in the preamble of the Constitution They say in order to create a more perfect union, in order to safeguard the general welfare, in order to, like, there are like 5 reasons they give. 4 of the 5 are conservative goals, and they're almost all the same. It's saying basically law and order. We need better law and order. And then finally, as you might guess, the 5th one was different, and I'm glad they added it, and that is to safeguard the liberty of American citizens. So only the 5th out of like 5 reasons in the preamble of the Constitution, which I invite you to check out, only the very last one was an enlightened reason for devising a new government. All right. So that generation had its chance, and it blew it. It behaved under the negative caricatures of both systems, of a democratic government and of a confederacy. All right. Anybody have any questions or comments on this one? All right. And secondly, I want to make sure I didn't pass it. No, this ordinance. Popular clamor for enlightened and classically liberal government thankfully extracted concessions from the founding fathers. All right, this is an interesting book by Pauline Maier. All right. Her depiction of the founding fathers is a lot closer to Howard Zinn's depiction than it is to Bernard Bailyn's. So remember, Bernard Bailyn, according to him, the founding fathers were ideologues, right? They were led by ideology. They were led by the French and Scottish Enlightenments and the Great Awakening, and they wanted to create a better world, right? But according to Howard Zinn, as you may recall, the founding fathers were an elite strata of the population. So, for instance, when you look at pictures, and you look at figures connected to the founding fathers, they were not a microcosm of the population. And remember, by microcosm, I mean like a mini example. They were not a mini example of the population at large. So, for instance, the majority of them had a college education. When you go outside this elite group, the number of people with a college education in the 1780s was like less than it was like a tenth of 1%. It was ridiculously low. All right. One of, if not the most common trade that the founding fathers who met and signed the Constitution practiced was an attorney. So many of them were lawyers. All right. And then when you look at their net worth, to be honest, I haven't read Beard, Charles Beard, Beard. He wrote a book in the Progressive Era, and he gave stats on the founding fathers, and to demonstrate just how privileged, elitist, and how much they were not a microcosm of the society. And it portrays them as being very privileged and rich, obviously. And I apologize, I can't recall the name of the book, but it's by Charles Beard, and it's on the founding fathers. So at any rate, you have this set group of men, right? And they gather in Philadelphia. And notice one of the first things they did is they shut the press out. The press was not invited in there. Yes, Madison and I think 2 others tried their best to keep notes, and thank goodness for progeny for the rest of us in the future to be able to glean from their notes. But other than that, there was no secretary that deliberately officially existed to take notes of what was being said and discussed, etc. Then also in addition to that, they write the Constitution, right? And we're gonna go to it next as an assignment. And I think you would agree with me that in many ways, especially when you think of the French and Scottish Enlightenments of their time, the federal Constitution is pretty conservative. It really is, which would make sense, right? Because these guys, like something as radical like down in Latin America, you had Francisco de Miranda. You had right below us in Mexico, Father Miguel Hidalgo, right? His shout or grito of Dolores. Um, they wanted land redistribution. They wanted to redistribute the land, the property of some, and allocate it to the poor. They wanted to do away with slavery. They wanted to do away with the exploitation and the segregation of Native Americans. Okay. So to me, that is pretty enlightened, what they tried down in Latin America. Now, notice I said tried, because they didn't succeed, either of those two who were, depicted as ideologues down in Latin America. But up here, right, there was no land redistribution program. There was no universal citizenship for all human beings. There was no major fight besides the Quakers to end slavery. And it wasn't even really noted by Madison to even fall in discourse in their debates about enfranchising or giving citizenship rights to Native Americans under any circumstances, and much less women. So at any rate, they put this together, this Constitution, and then what they decided is they were going to go back to their respective states, and they were going to ratify or approve it. All right. She finds some interesting information whereby the founding fathers tried to keep this hushed. They didn't want the press to print this Constitution, much less to give a say to the common people to be able to read it and give their take on the document. Okay. They did not go out of their way to invite people to the ratification conventions. So basically, it almost is tantamount in her book to the founding fathers wanting to correct their own paper, right? Did you imagine that as a student? Like, of course, they're going to ratify it. They're the ones who wrote it. Okay. But what's cool is in states like Massachusetts, word gets out, and village and small town after another begins to have a local election. They elect representatives who come unannounced and uninvited to the ratification conventions. And they say, okay, hey, I am so-and-so from Braintree, Massachusetts. And the people in my town say that they want to be able to read this Constitution before I give my okay to it. In other cases, they had very specific requests. We want to make sure, it was often found amongst those that came uninvited, that they wanted something to do with the rights of suspects, because they really felt wronged by England, especially like for economic violations of the mercantilist restrictions. Remember, they eventually were thrown to the Navy, the naval courts of the Vice Admiralty courts. And they wanted to make sure that nothing like that could happen in this new republic. So a lot of them had to do with due process rights of suspects. And some thankfully mentioned freedom of the press. Some mentioned separation of church and state, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So at any rate, finally, enough journalists print not only the Constitution for all to read and see, but enough journalists also write their opinions, their critical opinions of the present form of the Constitution, right? Enough uninvited guests came to ratification conventions, making demands on behalf of the people of their towns who had elected them, and so forth, so that the Federalists, the conservatives, felt obligated. They felt obliged to basically acquiesce. Remember, when you acquiesce to something, oftentimes you don't want to. Something beyond your power is making you feel forced to do it. So you begrudgingly give in. So that's what happens here, according to her book, is the founding fathers almost begrudgingly acquiesce and say, okay, fine, we'll make some alterations, we'll make some additions, etc. And of course, the most famous addition that she includes in her book are the Bill of Rights. So yes, originally, it is true, the founding fathers were not going to put a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. But enough popular clamor arose that they felt indebted to them to do so. And remember, the whole shadow of Shays' Rebellion, all the drama of forcing the militias to fight under the Continental Army, all of that is fresh in their memory. So they are not wanting some war with the poor and with the commoners for various reasons. So all of that is going to put pressure upon them to give in. So at any rate, that's what happens. So she contends that a lot of the most enlightened, the most liberal inclusions in the Constitution were not originally there. They were not originally intended by the conservative Federalists who wrote the Constitution, but because of a public, almost upheaval, a public outcry of demands, the founding fathers acquiesced and begrudgingly included them in their Constitution. So the depiction of the founding fathers is negative. The depiction of that generation of people, the public at large, is wonderful. They're heroic in her book. So does anybody have any questions? Right. So you guys doing okay? Do you guys feel okay about these two?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Make sure I have all your names, which I do. All right. Well, I know it's a little short, but that's kind of all I had to share from these two today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Always, and I always appreciate you coming every time. Thank you. You'll get your 5 points, and I greatly appreciate it personally. All right, you guys have a great week and good luck on this one, okay?
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
You as well, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.